morning, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Reinforce the Horse. Today we are here with Mr. Erik Molvar. Erik Molvar is a wildlife biologist and executive director with Western Watersheds Project, a nonprofit environmental conservation group that works to protect and restore wildlife and watersheds throughout the American West. Erik's conservation work has included wilderness inventories in Wyoming's Red Desert, defending public lands from massive oil and gas projects during the George W. Bush administration, leading sage grouse and lesser prairie chicken conservation efforts, and reforming livestock grazing on western public lands. He appears in the new film about the wild horse issue, Wild Beauty.
So welcome, Erik. We're glad to have
thanks
you
very
here.
much.
That's just a short introduction, but would you like to elaborate and maybe share a little bit more about yourself?
Well, sure. Initially, as a wildlife biologist, I did my research on the behavioral ecology and ecosystems ecology of Alaskan moose. And Alaskan moose are evolving into herd behavior that is really similar to what you see in elk and deer and bears some relation to horses. And everywhere else in the world besides Alaska, moose are pretty solitary creatures. And during the breeding season, they're called serial tending bond breeders, which means that an individual male moose will go out in search of a female, find her when she's in estrus, and then guard that single female and breed with that female, and then go off in search of another female. But in Alaska, moose are grouping up into herds of up to 30 to 40 moose. And they're harem breeders, much like horses are and elk and deer. And they're gathering up into these large herds, it turns out, because of predation risk. And up in Alaska, moose aren't in deep forests. They're in the open, brushy tundra. They're exposed to the eyes of predators. And so they're grouping up in order to be safe from predation. And that's what I found in my thesis research. And my thesis research during that time, my advisor directed me to a book on wild horses by a fellow biologist by the name of Joel Berger. And he researched wild horse behavior in Nevada. And he found that horses choose to the habitat along the Bajada areas, Bajadas are sort of the aprons at the foot of the mountains where these temporary streams bring down rich sediment and have, as a result, an increased fertility and an increased vegetation production. And so the horses specialize in using these areas. And as I moved into the livestock grazing issue, one of the major differences between wild horses and livestock is that livestock concentrate their grazing activities within 2 miles of water sources, and in particular, right along stream channels where they're the lush hotspots for biological diversity. And so they have really heavy impacts in these desert oasis areas versus the wild horses, which spread themselves out over very large areas. And they're using landscapes preferentially that are far from water much of the time. So that's a little bit more about my background and my first experience with the wild horse issue, which really was an academic one because the family bonds that you see in wild horses are seen in moose as well, but in a very primitive way and a much less socially developed way. And horses are much more of a social mammal than moose are.
Oh, very interesting. I didn't realize, I think you might have touched on that in the talk that I listened to about the moose. What it sounds like you learned a lot about horses by your observations surrounding moose.
Well, and that's kind of true. And then today, when I go out and visit wild horses, the experience is very similar to my thesis research with Alaskan moose, because with the moose in Denali National Park, there are collared animals. There are animals that have been habituated or accustomed to having researchers closely with them. So you can actually stand with a group of moose and they won't pay any more attention to you than if you were a fly. You can be right in the middle of a herd of moose, so you can be taking your notes on their behavior and following a focus animal. And I've almost tripped over a bedded female when I was following a different moose, taking notes on their behavior, didn't notice the female moose bedded down in front of me. And sometimes you almost trip over them. And the moose will jump up and you'll jump back, and everybody kind of mentally saying, "Excuse me," and you carry on with your day. but the moose don't pay any attention to you, and that cuts both ways, because when you're during the rut and you have these big harem masters with these giant racks of antlers, the harem master will defend his cows against any interlopers. And so if there's another male moose that comes to contest that particular, herd of females with the harem master, you'd better watch out, because not only does the male moose not mind that you're there, but it doesn't mind running over you either if you get between that moose and another moose that he's angry with. And that had happened a number of times with me and other researchers, where some young satellite bull would come, kind of swooping into the edge of the harem, trying to steal a copulation with a cow. And the male would get upset with that and start antler rocking, which is their behavior. That's a warning, and come toward that smaller male. And the smaller male would come and hide behind the biologists for safety. And so you had to kind of watch your P's and Q's. And so when I go to watch wild horses out in their native habitats, in many cases, they too are fairly tolerant to humans. And you have to kind of watch out that you don't get too close, and that you don't get in between two stallions in much the same way as you wouldn't want to get between two bull moose during their rut.
As a biologist, what's your opinion about in this whole wild Mustang idea? And I know that's a big controversial topic, but there's a quote that I remember you mentioning. You said the livestock industry likes to believe, and BLM has largely bought into this belief, that the cattle belong there and they live there, but really the cattle are often trucked into these lands for several months at a time to graze, and then they go back to their home ranch. I remember you saying that, and it just kind of, I know nothing really about cattle or grazing. So a lot of this stuff is really new to me and Alyssa and our family. We have two previously wild Mustangs. They both came from the White River, Nevada HMA. We love them to death, and they seem to really be enjoying their domestic life. Like you've mentioned, you're kind of like a neutral party. We're not like trying to sway people one way or the other as far as like
the roundups go.
Yeah, the controversy around the roundups. But what we're trying to do, what Alyssa and I are interested in, is really just to gather more information about and understanding about their lifestyle prior to being domesticated. We often joke around and say that at least for your horse Willow, she wasn't wild to begin with. That she is just kind of really loving the
domestic life.
Yeah.
But she wasn't always like that. It's just like, had her for a couple years, and that's how she is now.
Yeah. As a biologist, what do you think about the wild horses and their subsequent domestication?
Well, starting with that, wild horses are very different from domestic horses in a lot of different ways. And the first and the most obvious way is that, the stallions in the wild, they're fully operating in having social bonds or bands of mares and defending those mares. And sometimes a lieutenant stallion will help with the cohesion of the band and to fight off rivals. And in a domestic setting, you geld or remove the testicles of the stallions, and that takes away their hormones. And so they no longer behave as stallions. And I remember there was a year where I worked as a wrangler with a dude operation in Big Sky, Montana. And we had a number of horses of all different kinds. And we did include in our herds, we had a number of formerly wild horses or Mustangs that had that BLM Freeze brand and that we used for guests to ride. And over the course of the season, many of those wild horses became so gentled that we could use them for kids and use them as kid horses. And that's the kind of ultimate expression of being trustworthy. If you're a horse, if you're willing to take the risk of putting a child who doesn't know horsemanship on the back of a horse and trust that horse that much, that's indicative of the fact that these are horses that are really gentle and really trustworthy. And so wild horses can become that way. But in the wild, they behave in an entirely different fashion. And so you see this very complex social organization that you really don't see in domestic horses out in the pasture. And we had a stallion that was uncut, and we didn't ride that stallion. And there was a really good reason. I mean, and stallions are naturally wilder because of their testosterone and other hormones that are raging all the time. You have to worry about stallions in proximity to mares when the mares come into season. They're just not, the kind of horses that as a tourist operation, you would put, even the guides on the back of typically. And that's true out in the wild as well. And in the wild, you see these stallions, these harem master stallions or band stallions, the dominant ones, fighting, rearing and boxing each other with their forehooves and kicking each other and having real dominance fights. And sometimes, stallions can get their jaws broken or their legs broken or, otherwise be crippled for life, by these fights. They're very serious. And you don't see that at all in domestic horses, nor do you see the social organization in domestic herds of horses. When we had we had 50 to 100 horses out in a pasture or in a paddock together, and they didn't group up into these bands. They didn't have these kind of almost family sorts of interactions with each other. They certainly interacted with each other socially, but they didn't have that same kind of tight organization and move together as individual subherds within that group. And so wild horses are a really very different animal from a domestic horse, and they behave much more like elk or deer, but with an even more rich and socially complex set of interactions with each other than either of those species, because they're even more social as mammals than elk or deer are.
So, as a scientist, what do you think your opinion is as far as the capturing of a wild horse and transforming it into a domestic one? Is it sort of like then a stripping away of that wild nature, or is it a suppression of, or is it just of them just kind of coping with their new environment? What I'm hearing from you is that out in the wild, they kind of have they're more in touch with that sort of collective consciousness of the herd mentality. And when they come back, or when they come into domesticated life, they perhaps just don't require that anymore.
Well, certainly when you take a wild horse into a domestic setting, you're transporting it into an alien environment that they must then relearn how to behave, how to act, and whatnot. And based on our experience at this operation where I worked, we had both mares and we had some gelded stallions. But it's my understanding that the gelded stallions were brought into the domestic setting very young. And you wouldn't try, for example, to take a 10-year-old stallion, geld that stallion, and put him into a domestic setting and then put a guest in your tourist operation on their back, because that stallion may retain a lot of their wild characteristics and may be a little unpredictable, may take an expert horseman or horsewoman to ride, versus a stallion that went into a domestic setting much younger may not have as much of those wild characteristics. That's one item, but you're taking them out of their natural environment and you're putting them into a human environment, and they're interacting not just with other domestic horses that don't behave like wild horses, but also with humans on a regular basis. And so all of those behaviors that they then learn to exhibit and learn in terms of being able to be gentle to ride and tolerate another mammal on their back, which is, you wouldn't go out into a wild horse herd and hop bareback on the back of one of them, because you'd be bucked off and maybe badly maimed or killed if you tried to do that. And so this whole process of domestication is one that involves a great deal of time and patience. And it probably involves more time and patience for a formerly wild Mustang than it would for a horse that was born and grew up in captivity. because it has its own, kind of understanding of how it's supposed to act and be in a wild sense that doesn't have a parallel in a domestic setting. So for the horses that we had in our group in the beginning of the year, the wild Mustangs, we would gentle them in by having the wranglers ride them as our horses for a while until they were ready to be ridden by guests. And the wild horses, almost universally, were very spooky and green at the beginning of the year. And you'd take them out on the trail, and if they would see a stick or a log, they'd levitate and go sideways. And you have to be careful to maintain your seat, while this horse, expressed its fright, and then calm down again. And then over time, they would kind of gentle in, and as I said earlier, some of them would be gentle enough to put kids on. But it took that a bit where each spring they would have to, because they've been in pasture all winter, they'd have to kind of relearn how to be a domestic horse.
Curious about the film that you were in, Wild Beauty. I haven't yet had a chance to watch it yet, but it's on my watch list. Can you tell me a little bit about the movie itself and the part that you played in it?
Well, Wild Beauty is a documentary film about the struggles that wild horses face on Western public lands. And it was put out by a filmmaker by the name of Ashley Avis Winters, who's a very talented filmmaker. And she's an up and coming rising star in Hollywood. And she put together this film traveling all over the West, seeing multiple roundups, with the helicopters that chased the wild horses into the traps. She engaged in, kind of undercover investigative journalism, following horses as they were taken, some of the wild horses that were taken to auction facilities in Texas that were then sold to slaughter buyers from Mexico that bought these horses to truck them down south of the border where it's legal to slaughter them for meat. And they interviewed myself and a number of other experts on the issue as part of the film. So I play a small role as one of the interviewees. I represent a conservation group that doesn't itself really have a strong position on the wild horse issue. I mean, in our thinking, wild horses evolved in North America. The archaeological consensus is that they went extinct probably between 5,700 years ago and 1555 now, based on the new science. And during that period, according to the archaeological record, there were no wild horses in North America. And of course, that's only about 5,000 years out of the last 54 million years when there were wild horses for most of that time, except for that 5,000 year period. On the other hand, there is one ethnography by an indigenous woman who looked at the oral traditions of the indigenous people and found that many indigenous people believed that the wild horses never were extirpated in North America and were here the whole time. She also cited some evidence that there might be archaeological evidence that they were here continuously. So it's very much a live controversy as to whether wild horses are a native wildlife or non-native. From my own personal viewpoint, as a wildlife biologist, I don't think that you can call them either native or non-native, principally because us biologists don't have a standard definition of what constitutes native. And so that makes it really hard. If in a gray area like horses have in the North American continent, if you don't have a really bright line of what constitutes native and what constitutes non-native, and how long horses evolve with these ecosystems, and whether 5,000 years is enough time for them to lose native status because they were obviously native before that time, then it becomes an endless controversy where you can't ever resolve it. And then, of course, from our perspective, we come at it from the perspective of domestic livestock. And as you mentioned earlier, domestic livestock are grazed all over Western public lands. About 80% of the Bureau of Land Management lands in the West are grazed by domestic cattle and sheep. This is not a natural situation. This is not a situation where you have animals that evolved in that ecosystem and are ecologically suited to be out in these arid lands. Instead, you have animals that evolved in Europe and were transported here. And then when they're put out on the range in the Western public lands, they're authorized to graze 50 to 65% of the total forage production for the entire year off, going into cattle, going into sheep, not available for bighorn sheep, not available for elk or mule deer, not available for wild horses where they exist on the 11% of Western public lands where there are some wild horses. So you have this kind of industrial commercial operation that is being superimposed over native ecosystems all over the West, doing tremendous ecological damage. And at the same time, you have wild horses on a small minority of the public lands, typically at much smaller densities, typically taking much less of the forage. But the livestock industry is very cleverly and cynically scapegoating the wild horses for the damage that's being caused by cattle and sheep. And that's where Western Watersheds Project comes into it, because we believe that it is our duty to tell the public the truth of what's going on Western public lands, and that the overriding major impact on Western public lands is not the wild horse, even where they occur. It's typically the cattle and sheep that are trucked in from somewhere else, from private lands, put on the public lands, typically for 3 to 6 months, and then trucked back home. And the idea that we ought to have this commercial operation raising beef and raising wool on public lands is a pretty tenuous one to make when you look at the proportion of American beef that actually sets a hoof on Western public lands. 1.6% of American beef production has any nexus at all with Western public lands, even though we think of the West as being the kind of the place of the American cowboy, the place where beef are raised, and that's where you find the cattle. The reality is that it's Ohio, it's Florida, it's Missouri, it's states that have abundant rainfall and productive vegetation that raise the most and produce the most beef. And the arid Western public lands that are so marginal for the cow do very little for beef production. So if all of that beef production from all of the public lands were to be removed tomorrow with a magic wand, the American consumer wouldn't feel any pinch at all in the amount of beef that's available for their hamburgers or the price of the product. It simply wouldn't be even noticeable.
Yeah, and it just seems like, to me, coming into this, I mean, as we've mentioned plenty of times on our show, horses didn't enter my life until the end of 2018. So I'm very new to it. Before that, knew absolutely nothing about animals at all, really. I mean, other than the dogs or cats that we've had in domestic life, but over the past half decade, have certainly learned a lot more about horses and other livestock in general, and just have gotten a lot more interested in farming practices across the board. And it just seems to me like the numbers and the data and the information from different sources just don't line up. And of course, I'm a bit biased in the way of kind of looking at the wild horses. The question that often arises after having now a couple previously wild mares on our property and hearing a lot more of the controversy surrounding the roundups and whatnot. I've never been a hunter, but I've had plenty of friends and family who are avid hunters of all different types of livestock. And I've never heard of any sort of issues with population control or the land being able to support, say, elk or deer or any other sort of animal out there. And it just seems to me that horses, the wild horses, have this sort of salient target on their back, so to speak, with regard to these roundups. And can you perhaps elaborate on that, or kind of dispel some of that mystery to me?
Well, sure. Well, first of all, wild horses, like any herbivore, if they get too overpopulated or dense in their population, just like elk, just like deer, they can damage the range. The reality is that they're so aggressively rounded up and removed from public lands that it's rare, if ever, that they get to that population level that can do real ecological damage. And that's similarly true to species like elk and mule deer in the West, although there have been a couple of examples of times when elk got so overpopulated that they started damaging their range. And Yellowstone National Park in the 1980s was a real example where the elk were really overpopulated, grazing down the range. When I was in my undergraduate program at the University of Montana, Les Pengelly, who was the kind of eminence gris of the wildlife department, would go out and he would take all the introduction to wildlife management students out to Yellowstone in March, and we would go ski around from elk to elk. And they were, the big harem masters with the giant racks were the ones that would die because elk or moose or any of the members of the deer family during the fall, the males stop eating. And then they're expending all this energy fighting and breeding, and they're not eating. So they're going into winter in a lower nutritional state than are the females. And so in the springtime, when there are die-offs due to inadequate forage to sustain them, it's always the big males that die first. And we would go cross-country skiing and ski from giant elk to giant elk, looking at all the dead elk. And it was because there wasn't, kind of any natural population regulation there. And then in the mid-1990s, wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, and that brought things back into a better balance. And that, together with increased and more aggressive hunting by the sport hunters, brought that population down. Similarly, in Rocky Mountain National Park today, there's an overpopulation of elk, and that's damaging the range. That's not the prevalent condition in wild horse country all across the West, even though the Bureau of Land Management and the livestock industry constantly tell the public that wild horses there are too many of them. And historically, if you look at the science, before when Lewis and Clark traveled into the American West in the early 1800s, according to the scientific estimates, there were 2 to 7 million wild horses at that time. And as Lewis and Clark went west, they documented an abundance of wildlife: 60 million bison, 380,000 wolves, 10 million elk. There are only 1 million today. Huge numbers, 100 million pronghorn, huge. It was like an American Serengeti of wildlife. And wild horses were part of that mix. And the land and the vegetation was in better shape than anyone alive today has ever seen it. So that's the thriving natural ecological balance that we really strive for today, and which the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act requires by law. But the difference is today, we've got all these domestic livestock getting trucked out into the public lands, grazing off 50 to 65% of the forage and leaving very little left for all of the other wild herbivores that are out there, and very little left for the grasses to survive on. And in the West, in the interior West, unlike the Great Plains, which has sod-forming grasses that evolve with heavy grazing from bison, in the interior Western basins, you have bunch grasses that are perennials that live for 10, 20, 30 years at a time. And those are the dominant grasses. And they are not evolved with heavy herbivory. And so when you have heavy grazing from domestic livestock on these grasses year after year after year after year, and you beat them down and beat them down and beat them down, eventually you kill them. And eventually, once they're killed, then invasive grasses like cheatgrass and ventonata and medusa head get a chance to. These are grasses from Eurasia that have been brought in accidentally in most cases, and are invasive species. And they really, once they get a toehold, they can really explode in their populations and create a real fire hazard that then wipes out a lot of the fire intolerant native vegetation like sagebrush. So it becomes a real problem. The wild horses are trivial in their role in that story. It's really all about domestic cattle. And frankly, there's lots of places on private land that the domestic cattle could be produced with a lot, where they're a lot more ecologically suitable. One of the real tragic ironies of the wild horse story is that with these aggressive helicopter roundups, where they're rounding up thousands of wild horses every year, and they're adopting a few, and the rest of them go into what's called long-term holding, the government is renting out pastures from livestock producers that are bumping cattle off of these pastures in order to have livestock on, or in order to have captive wild horses on them for the rest of their lives. And the wild horses are the taxpayer has to pay $60 per horse per month to get them off of range that the livestock producers are paying $1.35 a month to put a cow on. So it makes no sense at all. And they're bumping the cattle off of areas where they're ecologically suited in eastern Oklahoma and eastern Kansas, where you have lots of rainfall, lots of vegetation production. It's great for cattle production. You're moving the cattle out so you can bring in horses that used to be on public lands where they're more ecologically suited than the cattle are.
Wow. So if they're removing horses from the from the lands. I mean, the Bureau of Land Management, like you said, removes a good amount each year. Are they taking out other livestock such as the elk and the deer, the wild livestock as well, or are they just removing the wild horses for the domestic cattle and such?
Well, they're just taking out the wild horses. All of the other native species are not gathered and removed and kind of warehoused elsewhere like the wild horses are. And there's another difference here too, which is that we hunt the cattle, or we hunt the elk, we hunt the deer, we hunt the pronghorn and the bighorn sheep to a certain extent, and we've also stripped away all of the native predators. And wolves and mountain lions would be extremely good wild horse predators if they were not suppressed by the livestock industry. The livestock industry has basically extirpated these species over much of the West already. Wolves were entirely extinct in Western North America until the 1990s, when they were reintroduced into Yellowstone and they started dispersing into Glacier National Park naturally from Canada.
Were those predators removed by the livestock industry because, of course, they're predatory against the livestock? And so hunting, trapping, whatever occurred to basically eradicate those predators, and then subsequently reintroduce. I think we had a situation like that go on here locally. We're in southeast Arizona in years past, up in the Catalina Mountains. It just comes to mind. I don't know a whole heck of a lot about it, but having to do with the bighorn sheep and mountain lions. So I think at one point there was this great push to remove all the mountain lions. Then the bighorn sheep got overpopulated, and then they removed the bighorn sheep or something like that, and then ultimately brought them back. And so there's this sort of like manipulation of human involvement to kind of balance these things. I mean, people like yourself who study this, and you're biologists, you're scientists, it seems like human interaction on any wave of the spectrum
Just
doesn't seem to work.
Yeah.
Well, in the United States in particular, we have what's called the North American model of wildlife management. And it is a model in many ways for the way wildlife management concepts and ideas have been exported throughout the world. But it's very firmly rooted in a philosophy called dominionism, which is to say that, even from a religious standpoint, that humans have an obligation to manage and dominate and suppress nature and make the land fruitful and make the land productive and profitable. And that is our role, instead of a more ecological approach, as the early wildlife biologist Aldo Leopold was a proponent of, which says that we should be in balance with nature and that we're part of the ecosystem, and that we shouldn't try to destroy or disable the ecosystem and dominate it and then control everything. We should learn to coexist with the ecosystem. Instead, the path that a North American wildlife management ended up going down was this idea that we're going to control everything. So we're going to wipe out the native predators so that we don't have any competition with our hunters from wolves or from mountain lions or from grizzly bears. We're going to eliminate all the animals that are not, economically beneficial to our particular profit-making industry. So for the livestock industry in particular, they have waged a campaign over more than a century to wipe out prairie dogs, to wipe out coyotes, to wipe out beavers even. That were inconvenient to their operations. They're the ones that are responsible largely for wiping out the mountain lions and the wolves and the grizzly bears throughout the American West. Just about the entire American West had an abundant population of all of those species. If you look at the California state flag, it has a picture of a grizzly bear on it. Grizzly bears haven't been in California since before 1900 because they were driven entirely extinct, but they were abundant throughout the state before that. And throughout the West, you had all of these species, and the livestock industry and its allies in the federal and state governments I mean, there was even an organization that was created under the U.S. Department of Agriculture that was originally called Animal Damage Management Control, and later became known as Wildlife Services, because they provided wildlife the service of ending their life and getting rid of them. And so this is a livestock industry, basically a hit squad that goes around the West with aerial gunning and trapping and poisoning campaigns to get rid of things like coyotes and wolves and mountain lions. And so we have so disrupted the natural order of things that now today, wild horses are out on the range, and in places where you still do have abundant populations of mountain lions, you're seeing major mountain lion predation on wild horses, proof positive that wild horses do have natural predators and that they can play an important role in the population dynamics. But we've removed that population influence across most of the West. Wolves are the coursing predators, which run their prey over distance and are effective out in the open sagebrush. But we've eliminated wolves from the open sagebrush, and the only places where they survive are densely timbered mountain areas. So we got to bring back these native carnivores to be part of the whole equation in the West, and that will benefit not just the wild horse population dynamics in a natural way, but it will also benefit animals like moose and elk and mule deer, which are susceptible to a livestock disease called chronic wasting disease. It's a brain prion that's like mad cow disease. And once they catch it, they die. But once they are infected, these elk and deer and moose will become disoriented, and they'll drool, and they're slow, and they're easy prey for the natural predators if you have them. And the natural predators could clean out those infected individuals out of the herd and cut the sickness right out of the herd if we just let them do their job. But instead, we've eliminated all these large carnivores, and we're relying on hunters to do that. And frankly, if you're a hunter and you know about chronic wasting disease, I'm a hunter and I know about it, the last thing you're going to do is shoot an animal that's drooling, because you're not going to be able to eat that meat. Because if you go and get it tested, which you need to do anymore, and it comes out with chronic wasting disease, you can't eat that meat, because you could catch the chronic wasting disease and you could have this deadly brain prion. There are some new studies that show that feeding monkeys the infected meat of elk or deer that have chronic wasting disease, those monkeys can contract the chronic wasting disease. If a monkey can do it, then other primates like humans can do it as well. So that's a really major kind of issue for hunters right now that could be addressed by returning some of these large carnivores to the landscape, help clean out some of these diseased animals from the herds. And at the same time, it has the collateral benefit of providing some natural population influences for wild horses as well.
So if we were to bring back the predators, the natural predators of the land, then would it not be necessary for the Bureau of Land Management to capture the wild horses anymore?
It's an interesting question. It's an untested hypothesis. I think that, you'd have to wait and see and look. One of the things that's really messed up about the Bureau of Land Management's wild horse management program is that they have got increasingly, kind of eliminated areas that originally had wild horses over time. So when the Wild and Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act was enacted in the early 1970s, the first thing that the federal government did was it gave the ranchers the opportunity to claim the wild horses and clean them out and get rid of them where they occurred. And so in most of Montana, for example, they had thriving wild horse populations all over the state. Most of those were completely eliminated because the ranchers said, oh, those are our wild horses. And they gathered them up, put brands on them, put them into domestic service, and there weren't any wild horses anymore. Then over time, almost half of the wild horse herd management areas that originally were established under the act have been zeroed out, and wild horses have been entirely eliminated. So what's happening increasingly across the West is wild horses survive on smaller and smaller areas that are becoming increasingly isolated from each other. So that creates genetic problems, because if you're isolated at a small population, you can have inbreeding depression, you can have birth defects, and the population then spirals to zero. And it also means that you can't have any immigration or emigration, the natural flow of horses from areas of high density to areas of low density, because you're artificially constraining them to little tiny patches of land that have been artificially designated by the Bureau of Land Management as areas where it's acceptable to have wild horses. And the minute that a horse steps outside of that area, it's no longer by law considered a wild horse by definition and can be rounded up without any kind of public accountability. So it's a very complicated question. So it has several different kinds of elements to it. Yes, let's bring back the large native carnivores to let them have their role. I think that, for my money, wild horses could be allowed to live in larger, more interlinked areas so that they can move back and forth from areas that are getting overgrazed to areas that have less impact. All of these are a possibility. And yet one of the big problems is that the Wild Horse and Burro program inside the Bureau of Land Management is basically a wholly owned and operated subsidiary of the livestock industry. And it's there to act at their benefit and their calling to get rid of wild horses when the livestock industry asks. And for example, my organization and some wild horse organizations are currently suing over a plan to remove all of the horses out of 2 herd management areas in the Red Desert and reduce the number of wild horses allowed in remaining areas. That would isolate the Adobe Town herd entirely from other wild horse areas. That creates that isolation that's such a big problem. And it's all at the behest of the Rock Springs Grazing Association. And the Rock Springs Grazing Association owns some private checkerboard parcels in the middle of the Red Desert, and they don't want wild horses competing with their cows. So they want to get rid of all the wild horses. And so they're pushing the Bureau of Land Management to get rid of these wild horses. And the Bureau of Land Management has done their bidding in the case of this plan amendment they just recently approved. However, if you look at the Red Desert, at the time when that environmental impact statement was being done, the Bureau of Land Management found that all of these lands already meet the thriving natural ecological balance. Yet, even with the ecological health being already well established in the Red Desert, they're still zeroing out herd management areas. That's what we're suing them over, in part, is the idea that they're not listening to the Wild Horse and Burro Act. They're not setting what they call the appropriate management levels according to what's needed to get that thriving natural ecological balance. In fact, in 2020, when the environmental impact statement was rolled out, there were 5,000 plus wild horses in this complex. And then they had a big gather over 2021 and early 2022 when they removed 3,500 of them. So they took most of them away already. And even before they started taking them away, they were already meeting that thriving natural ecological balance. So there's a real disconnect between land health and BLM policy. And the explanation for that is the livestock industry just doesn't want any competition. And they're not just fighting wild horses. They're asking for elk populations to be reduced because they're having what they call elk depredations on their private hayfields and things of that nature as well. So it's basically any animal that's not conducive to maximizing your livestock profits it becomes a target for elimination or reduction by the livestock industry.
You mentioned the term dominionism. Just what came to mind just as that word rolled off your tongue is this, and you even mentioned balance or imbalance rather. And it just seems to me it's like this age-old discussion of East versus West, really. How we in present day necessarily, but we of like ancient humanity, it seems like we have gone from this idea of very integrated with nature and the more indigenous styles of living to post-industrialization and even various religions and whatnot, bringing in that dominion and like we are the the top dogs of the earth and what we say goes versus trying to live in harmony. And the horses for us have been almost more of a spiritual connection than they have been a pet or an
a
animal.
hobby or yeah.
So I feel like there's a shift for the better in the way of human thinking, albeit maybe in small incremental steps toward that direction. But also, you mentioned that you're a hunter, and I'm not against hunting by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I feel like it's a necessary aspect, but I also struggle with the different aspects of these things and how the spirituality and the connection to nature versus what our modern day society delves into.
I think that's a really great observation and a really interesting point. And when you look at the indigenous cultures of North America, sure, there were a few of these cultures that had farming and empires and civilizations, but many of them were, were hunter-gatherer cultures that did not have permanent settlements, that moved across the land lightly, that existed in a balance with a variety and a richness of wildlife that we've never been able to equal with all of our modern wildlife management methods and understandings. We've never been able to bring back wildlife to the level that they were at the time that Lewis and Clark entered the Western United States. And, some would argue that, yes, these indigenous cultures didn't have the technology to dominate nature in the way that we do today. And that's true. But also, it is equally true that they lived in balance and in harmony with the natural world. And they were one species among many that were all part of an ecosystem. They're culturally, they didn't see themselves as needing to dominate or eliminate species or needing to control population numbers. That wasn't part of their philosophical construct. And if you look at Europeans, if you go far enough back in European history, before we had farming, we had indigenous hunter-gathering cultures, much like you had in North America as well. And those cultures lived much more in harmony with nature. But once you got the development of farming and then pastoral agriculture and then later cities and industrial development and now the information age, we've become increasingly distanced from nature. And as humanity has distanced itself from the natural world, people don't realize that the natural world is an entire web of life that's a complex, interconnected ecosystem with myriad complicated interrelationships, and everything has its role in the natural ecosystem. And we have become the dominant factor in many ecosystems. That puts us out of balance, and that puts the entire ecosystem out of balance. And that's why we see species extinctions. People talk about we're in the middle of the sixth mass extinction, and it's a faster extinction than any of the previous ones in terms of how fast it's occurring. And this is the only one that was ever mediated by one species, humanity. None of the other extinctions the first five extinctions were mediated by some other species becoming too dominant and too destructive. And so, I think as we move into the information age, and we're fairly early into it so far, one of our challenges as our species is how do we not only reimagine our connection with nature in a way that's less parasitic, less predatory, and more mutualistic, so that we're a member of the natural community instead of a heavy-handed, jackbooted overlord of it. And then how do we restore what's been lost? And one of the big concepts that's gaining a lot of traction right now is this idea of rewilding. And how do we take areas that we have substantially damaged or degraded with heavy-handed land uses and move them back toward a more natural balance? Can you take coffee plantations in Central America and reintroduce overstory rainforest trees onto them to increase bird diversity? Can you take areas that, in the central plains that are, or the eastern plains that would have had a lot more woodland, bring some of those overstory trees and have grazing together with shade trees. And so you can have more biotic diversity there. Can you take some of these single crop monoculture farming operations that are heavily dependent on pesticides and fertilizers and all other kinds of chemicals that are harmful to the environment and to humanity, and can you reconvert them to a more natural type of agriculture where you have multiple species? You don't have tilling. You don't have the constant, destruction of the entire ecosystem and bringing one crop species to dominate all of it, but you can have multiple species, and that can support not just human harvest of the foods we need, but also give you a little bit more diversity on the land so that other natural species, the native species, can make a comeback in those areas. That's a real challenge that humanity can engage in. But first, we have to get past the idea that we're the top dog and we need to control everything.
I agree with that, and I hear that 100%. That's been something Dad and I have talked about on our own a lot.
Ad nauseum.
Yeah.
And we feel, I feel personally, just as such a small grain of sand on the seashore with not very much weight to move in that direction. However, yeah, I mean, even this podcast is our little way of trying to move the wheel, so to speak, in that direction. Primarily, for the horses, it's such a it's a global, I mean, there's so many intricate details across the globe, all those things that you just mentioned. To me, it all kind of reflects back into what is at the individual level. I was just recently sitting at our local coffee shop. We live in a little small town in southeastern Arizona, and there was a cattle rancher there, and we were sharing a table and sparking conversation, and he's been in cattle ranching for 60 years or whatever. I just kind of off the cuff just asked him, "Hey, have you heard about the wild horse roundups, and do you have any opinion about that?" Without even batting an eyelash about it, was, "Oh, that's not my problem." So not even wanting to share his 6 decades plus of expertise in the local area, and just discounting the idea of even having an inkling of a conversation just because it's not
his problem.
Effectively, if his problem right there. And I think that, to me, is the systemic sort of issue, is that in our society, we basically, if it's out of sight, out of mind to ourselves, and it's not our problem, then we don't really have
it's not a concern in our minds and our lives. And we've talked about, we individually, we are the problem. We are all of the problem, and we can be the fix to all of the problems, every human individually. And so that comment that the cattle rancher made, clearly it didn't have any significance in what you and I have been talking about,
Right.
in our personal lives. But yeah, I feel like even that kind of shows some people don't give as much respect and credit to the wild animals, regardless, whether it's the wild horses or the elk or the deer or whatever, the wild animals who supposedly were there first.
Yeah, and there's a famous saying that goes like this: nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And so
I love that.
So you have to figure out what your superpower is going to be. And for me, I have made my career and been privileged to make a living at fighting for the natural world. And that's few people get the chance to do that. And our talented professional staff all do that all the time, full time. And we file lawsuits, and we petition species for the Endangered Species Act protections, and we intervene in Bureau of Land Management and Forest Service land use plans and try and push for better outcomes for nature. And often we win them. We have members. Some of our members write letters to these agencies to say, I'm a member of the public and I support kind of having more wolves on the ground, or I support wild horses, or I support healthy ecosystems, or I support rejuvenating our trout streams. And that makes a difference. And some of our members don't do any of that. And they're just content to write us a big check every month or every year and keep the professionals fighting that fight. And that's fine too. And then for individuals that aren't involved in any of those things, there are ways that you can learn about issues. So for the wild horses, go see the movie Wild Beauty. That's a great introduction to the issue, and it really encapsulates what you need to know to get started. to start speaking out on this issue and becoming an effective advocate. That's a great way to start, is to educate yourself. And the wild horse issue is one of the trickiest ones because there's so much misinformation that is intentionally being distributed by the Bureau of Land Management, by the Forest Service, by the livestock industry to try and advance their agenda of eliminating wild horses from the American West. That it's hard to see through all of those misstatements that are being put out intentionally to try and, kind of tell the public what it should be knowing about wild horses that reflects the agency's own agenda instead of the wild horse's best interest, the public interest, the interest of the health of the land. And so once you get educated, then you can start contacting your congressperson on any of these ecological issues. You can be making choices in your personal life that lower your own individual impact. Maybe you put solar panels on your roof. Maybe you start making sure you're taking full advantage of recycling. Maybe you're looking at trying to buy more products that don't involve pesticides or herbicides. There are many things that folks can do. And most importantly, as a society, we need to change the entire American zeitgeist, which right now and historically has always been focused on more growth, more, get rich quick schemes, more, make it all about me, make it all about my own individual best interest, and not thinking more broadly about the public interest as a whole, about the interests of nature and the natural world, not being a good citizen. That's a very American trait. We need to relearn that. And that, there are educators out there that can help us by teaching our kids what it means to be a good citizen of planet Earth. We are Earthlings first before we're Americans. And so being Earthlings, how do we be good citizens of the Earth? How do we take care of this ecosystem that is our only home in the entire great vastness of space, so that we don't drive ourselves extinct? These are big questions. Greta Thunberg has focused on climate change, and that's a really key fight. We have others who are focusing, like WWP, on the biodiversity crisis. That's a really big fight. There are others who are focused on trying to create, equitable and just economies. And you can't have equitable and just economies that destroy natural ecosystems, because that's what causes famine. That's what causes poverty. So, all of these things are ways that folks can learn to become citizens of the earth and exercise their own power and find their own way. And it's fantastic that you two have a podcast and you're amplifying certain ideas and putting ideas out there for folks to kind of think about. And, should I change my life? Should I change my perspective? Is there something more I can learn? That's a great opportunity for you to exercise your superpower in this too.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for that, and definitely resonates. Glad to be here and glad to do our part as much as we can. And it just seems to me a lot of people, just for lack of better terms, just kind of turn a blind eye. That's the pessimistic side of me, but the optimistic side of me feels a shift. And maybe that's just because it's happened within me over the past half decade or so, but I feel like collectively as humans, we're moving more in that direction. And that's exciting because I feel like there is a lot of potential, and we have potential not only to heal ourselves, but our land and still maintain a good degree of technology. And I'm not one to say, like, let's get rid of technology. I mean, we're sitting here talking face to face in real time. The technology is great in a lot of ways, but we just need to bring balance. And it sounds like your work is helping to do your part and bringing in that balance as well. So we appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, I have a question for you,
sure.
actually. In your studies with the wild horses, I've been curious about this for a while. We have 3 horses too, which you mentioned came from the wild. I'm curious, when they're being studied out in the wild, do they show to have any sort of like family dynamic? Like, is it detrimental to the horse to be rounded up and taken away from its family, aside from being taken to a domestic location? Like, does it hurt them to be taken away from their families.
Or are we otherwise anthropomorphizing that when they come home and we're like,
well, as a biologist, you've opened up a real interesting can of worms. And of course, in wildlife and science generally, there's a really strong urge not to anthropomorphize anything or project our own feelings or our own ideas onto the animals we're studying. On the flip side of that, and that comes from a place of, hey, we're humans, animals are not humans too. On the other side of that, humans are animals and animals are animals, right? So we're all animals together. And so the idea that there are humans over here and animals are over there and never the twain shall meet and there's nothing in common is a completely, arrogant and unrealistic kind of prejudgment to make. So we are a social species, humanity. So are horses. So are wolves. There are other species that are not really very social, like moose throughout most of the world, but moose in Alaska are getting more social. So these are things that are kind of some of the differences. When I was studying moose in Alaska, the way I used to think about it is that, we had moose that had individual tendencies. And for instance, there was a moose called Big Boy that was up in Denali. It had a really big rack, not such a big body, but a really big 72-inch set of antlers, really dominant harem master. And he developed what looked like a strategy where when he got in a fight with another large dominant bull for over his harem, he would position himself on the uphill side and the other moose would charge and Big Boy would catch that moose on his antlers and be driven back up the hill. And it looked like Big Boy was losing the fight because he was like getting pushed up the hill and getting pushed up the hill and getting pushed up the hill. But that other moose was pushing 2,000 pounds of moose up a hill for 5 minutes with great vigor and was wearing himself out. And it was just like Muhammad Ali with the rope-a-dope. When that moose would tire, Big Boy would turn it on. That fight would be over in a second. And Big Boy was like undefeated. He could never be beaten because he had this recurrent, what looked like a strategy to do this rope-a-dope and cause this other moose to wear itself out, pushing him up the hill so he could then, when the moose was tired, win the fight and win the harem. And this is what I came to know as a moosinality. This was an individual tendency that no other moose exhibited. He had his own moosinality. It wasn't a personality. It was a moosinality. Can I say what that moose was thinking or feeling? No, I don't know. I don't speak moose. I mean, I can imitate their calls, but I don't know what's in their minds. And maybe we'll never know what's in their minds. But, the same thing with horses. Individual horses very much have their own individual tendencies, their own horsenalities. And so, those individual tendencies, does that mean they're sentient? Does that mean they're having thoughts and feelings in the human sense? Maybe we'll never know because we don't speak horse either, right? We can imitate their calls and imitate their behaviors, but we can't know what's inside their minds. And nature is tremendously complex in that way. And it's necessary to approach these questions with a great deal of humility, knowing how much we don't know. But it is certainly true and unarguable that horses have very complex social bonds, that they, maintain individual relationships within these family bands, that outside these family bands, that individual horses can be in relation to other individuals in ways that they react differently to horse A than they do to horse B. Different bachelor males and the way that they interact outside the harems. There are obviously very complex social interactions. And then when we take these horses out of those kind of band relationships and herd relationships with other individual horses, and we transport them into a foreign environment, which is a human environment, and we take the males and take away their hormones, and so they're no longer really the same as a male with their full functioning hormonal capabilities and behaviors. That's different for them. How would it feel to be that animal going from the wild state and these complex interactions to a domestic state with a different set of interactions and interactions with two-legged primates? It's hard for me to imagine. But as a social animal myself, one would tend to suspect that it might be difficult for these animals to make that transition, to move into this unknown situation, to be taken away from everything they've ever known previously and have to know new things. That would seem to be, to me, it feels like there might be some trauma involved with that. That's projecting a trauma as a kind of a human kind of thing that we describe. Can that be applied to a wild animal? Maybe. We just don't know enough about the interior mind of other species. And, it could be that in 500 years, science will have advanced to the point where we can, speak those animals' languages, where we could have a little brain implant and telepathically know what they know. Who can say? Technology is a miraculous thing. It would be really fascinating as a behavioral ecologist. Every behavioral ecologist would love to have that knowledge.
Right. And that's interesting you bring that up, because it's like there's this dichotomy of spiritual and albeit emotional aspects to things versus the scientific technological aspect of things, because and we've interviewed a number of people already on the show that kind of take the more spiritual route, say like we most certainly have that ability. Animal communication is one, or tapping into the quantum field, as it were, and the collective consciousness of those animals, versus not being able to, because we don't have a particular gadget that humanity has crafted to peer into it. It kind of feels like the electromagnetic spectrum, and our eyes can only see and take in a certain rather small area of that spectrum, versus other types of devices that we've created as humans can actually see much wider ranges of that spectrum. And I think when it comes to knowing what animals are feeling and even being able to communicate with them, it's just a matter of being able to expand along the lines of that spectrum.
And that's, as a behavioral ecologist, I can confirm that, for mammals, behavioral cues are all over the place, and other mammals pick up on those cues. They have certain things that they do. A moose, a female moose that flattens her ears down and ducks her head down below her shoulder line, is about to charge. And that she's either about to charge another moose or she's about to charge you. And she's sending signals. And all mammals send signals, whether we know that they're sending signals or not. So, for instance, have you ever noticed that a dog can sniff out a bad person in the room and will growl at them because they're picking up something about their behavior that dog that finds threatening? And that dog might be picking up cues that even humans aren't sensitive enough to pick up. I think horses are animals that are sensitive in this way as well. So when I was a wrangler and I was riding horses every day, there was one horse that I rode a lot. It was an Appaloosa named Spotted Tail. No one else could catch him in the pen. The horse would just run away from everyone else, and I could catch him. And that was just something about, the vibe that horse was picking up from me, that he would have let me catch him. And he wouldn't let anybody else catch that single horse. In other cases, there are horses that might have had some kind of a past that might be, even violent towards humans, especially if they were abused by humans in the past. Humans, we are mammals too, just like horses. We're putting out information and signals that horses can pick up on. And I feel very strongly that horses are perceptive, and they're picking up things about humans that are pretty complex and subtle things. And we can pick up things about horses that are complex and subtle in much the same way. And that's a sort of a primitive form of interspecies communication. It's not something that you can always say, X, Y, and Z and make a formula and then know exactly how to behave around a horse, because somebody would have figured that out and would be selling it as a way to be a better horse person. But, if you think about grizzly bears, if you don't know very much about grizzly bears, it's often been said grizzly bears are very unpredictable. It's been my experience, because I spent 10 years writing hiking books in Alaska and the Western United States in grizzly country. And I actually had recommendations for how to behave around grizzly bears. I found that grizzly bears are incredibly predictable. and that they advertise what they're going to do when they're in a threatening posture. So if a bear starts turning to the side, it's showing you how big it is and telling you, you shouldn't mess with me because look how big I am. If the bear starts wagging its head back and forth and popping its teeth at you and woofing, it's basically saying, I'm not happy. You should back away. And if you back away, that bear will be satisfied. If you still don't do that and that bear tucks its head down between its front paws, that's an intention to charge. And it's about to charge you. And there's a famous example of a professional photographer in Glacier National Park who is photographing bears. And he's got these pictures of the bear, side-on threat display, bear head wagging and tooth popping, still snapping the pictures, bear tucking head down between his paws, intention to charge, bear charging. No more pictures. Photographer's dead. Photographer failed to take the cues that the grizzly bear was telling it, what to do. And we weren't listening. But if we listen to and learn the behaviors of these animals, it enriches our lives because they're telling us how to act in some cases.
I have one last question because you mentioned in the term anthropomorphizing. I can't ever say that right. And I think it was on Warwick Schiller's Journey On podcast. He was talking about it. I think he mentioned like back in 1992 was when scientists collectively got together and said that animals have feelings of some sort. Do you know anything about that?
Well, there are theorists that would ascribe sentience, which is thinking or feeling, to animals, and there's a lot of emerging science that suggests that they may. The difficulty is to try and separate out our own way of looking at their feelings from what they are actually feeling. So in other words, can we speak their language and know? And we're at the very beginnings of being able to decode some of those different things that these animals are expressing or maybe understanding based on hypothesis testing. We know very little. There's imagine that there is 100% to know. Maybe we know half of 1% of it right now. And, maybe we'll never know half of it. Maybe we'll only ever know less than half of it. But that's how science advances. You get a little sliver of information, you add it to the pile of other little slivers of information, and then together you look at them collectively and you create a picture of what we think we know. And all of that knowledge is temporary and provisional and subject to being superseded by new findings that give us a different understanding than we had before. And that's how science advances. And so one of the things that science teaches you is to approach life and nature and our own human understanding with a great deal of humility, because there's a lot more that we don't know than what we do know. And if we can explain 30% of it, by golly, we're doing a really good job of understanding what's going on out there, but there's still another 70% that we still haven't discovered yet.
I love it. And to me, it's like we don't know enough about how different cultures in humanity work and communicate together. It's like if I go to a foreign country, I don't know how to interact unless I've done a good amount of research ahead of time. And I could totally, just by being me, who I normally am on a day-to-day basis, really piss somebody off, not knowing their culture and how they interact. And so I think we have a lot of work to do. Maybe we start there. Maybe we end our conversation here with, heck, humans just have a lot of work to do within
our human
ourselves before we get to trying to figure out everything and fix the world out there that seems to do a pretty good job on its own if we just stay out of the mix.
Well, I think that last point is a really key and central one that goes back to that idea of humility and contrasts with the idea of dominionism, which is that, for many hundreds of thousands and millions of years, there was no such thing as wildlife management. And the wildlife did a lot better back then than they do under human habitation and human management. So nature is better at this than we are, because we don't understand very much about these the complex machinery of these interrelationships between different species and entire ecosystems. And we're not very good at the tinkering. And so often the best thing that we can do is back off and give nature a chance to manage itself. and allow natural processes to be more dominant and let human processes and control recede a little bit, sometimes you get better outcomes. And so I think that's a really important point for your listeners to understand about science. You're used to hearing these experts saying, we know this, we know that, therefore we need to do this. But you have to put a little asterisk up there and say, we know a little bit about this, and this is our best guess at this time, which might turn out to be completely wrong tomorrow based on new scientific findings.
Thank you so much, Erik. This has been a really incredible discussion and conversation. We thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on your podcast, and thank you for putting out these ideas to your listeners and into the universe and being part of that big global conversation about what it means to be human on planet Earth.